Welcome. Take a slow, deep breath. Pull the blankets up and let your shoulders drop. Wherever you are right now, allow this to be your safe, quiet space to simply pause and rest. As you settle into your comfortable spot, I often wonder about the distant places where these words find you. Which quiet corner of the world are you tuning in from tonight? If you'd like, leave a gentle note in the comments sharing where you're resting in the world. It brings so much warmth to see how far our stories travel across the map each night to reach you. If you sit quietly enough, where the fog clings to the sharp, dark basalt cliffs of Purandar, you can almost hear it. Not the clash of iron armor just yet, nor the thundering hooves of Maratha cavalry echoing across the rugged Deccan plateau, but the gentle, rhythmic sound of heavy rain falling upon ancient stone and the soft, steady breathing of a newborn child. Born high above the clouds, it was the 14th day of May, in the year 1657, high upon the jagged heights of Purandar Fort, where the wind whistles through narrow stone archways and the air carries the cool, earthy scent of wet moss and soil. A child entered the world. He was named Sambhaji, after his father's elder brother who had fallen in battle at Kanakajari. He was the firstborn son of Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj and Queen Saibai. A child birthed into a world where empires collided like tectonic plates, and where the very earth seemed to pulse with political tension. If you look closely at the maps of 17th century India, you will see a landscape carved into rival realms. To the north lay the vast, glittering, and formidable Mughal Empire, ruled by Shah Jahan, though soon to be claimed by his ambitious son Aurangzeb. To the south and east lay the ancient, decaying sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda, entrenched in courtly luxury and constant intrigue, and nestled right in the craggy, impenetrable heart of the Swarajya mountains was a rising spark, a dream of Hindavi Swarajya, self-rule, ignited by Sambhaji Maharaj. Into this crucible of defiance and danger, little Sambhaji was born. But shadow, as it so often does in the lives of great historical figures, fell early upon the cradle, barely 2 years after his birth. The delicate threads of domestic warmth were shattered. Queen Saibai, a gentle and beloved woman whose health had been steadily declining, passed away at Rajghat Fort in 1659. Sambhaji was just 2 years old. He would have no memories of his mother's voice, no recollection of her touch or the quiet lullabies she might have sung while rain beat against the wooden shutters of the royal chambers. In her place stood one of the most remarkable women in Indian history, Rajmata Jijabai. Jijabai, Shivaji's mother and Sambhaji's grandmother, was a woman carved from the very granite of the Sahyadris. She had raised Shivaji while her husband Shahaji Rajay served distant courts. She had weathered decades of political turmoil, betrayal, and war. Now, her steady, weathered hands wrapped around the young motherless boy. Imagine sitting beside a low brass oil lamp in the quiet halls of Rajghat Fort as evening settles over the hills. Jijabai would sit with the young prince, reading from the ancient epics of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. She did not teach him merely to recite verses. She taught him the ethics of kingship, the weight of duty, the burden of justice, and the absolute necessity of courage. She called him Bal Raja, the young king, and in his bright, observant eyes, she saw the future of the realm. As the boy grew, his environment became his greatest teacher. Rajghat was not a palace of soft velvets and lazy fountains. It was a military stronghold built on a razor-thin ridge. The smells that filled Sambhaji's early childhood were not exotic perfumes, but the scent of horse sweat, crushed neem leaves, smoking torchwood, cold rain on iron chainmail, and the sharp, earthy tang of grinding stones preparing spices for the fort's garrison. You can picture the young prince watching the Maratha horsemen ride into the fort courtyard at dusk, their cloaks damp with mist, their leather saddles creaking, their faces etched with the fatigue of long patrols through the mountain passes. He learned early that power in the Sahyadris was not inherited through title alone. It was earned through stamina, vigilance, and iron discipline. Sambhaji Maharaj, though constantly away on campaign, negotiating with sultans, raiding hostile garrisons, or carving out new territories, paid meticulous attention to his son's education. Sambhaji was not raised merely to be a soldier who could swing a sword. He was groomed to be an intellectual powerhouse. Scholars and tutors were brought from far and wide to Rajghat. The young prince possessed an extraordinarily sharp, inquisitive mind. By his early teens, Sambhaji was proficient in multiple languages, including Sanskrit, Marathi, Persian, and several regional dialects of the Deccan. He immersed himself in ancient political treatises, studying the Arthashastra, law, administration, statecraft, and archery. There was a rare dual nature emerging within the young prince. On one hand, he was a fiery, physically impressive youth who mastered horsemanship and the curved Maratha blade with effortless grace. On the other hand, he was a deeply contemplative scholar, a lover of poetry, philosophy, and classical literature. It was during these quiet, formative years that Sambhaji began writing his own literary works. Imagine a teenage prince, sitting late into the night while the mountain winds howled outside the thick fort walls, dipping a reed pen into dark black ink and writing Buddhabhushanam, a treatise on royal ethics and administration written in elegant, high Sanskrit. In Buddhabhushanam, Sambhaji reflected on what makes a true leader, writing that a king must protect his people as a father protects his children, that justice must be impartial, and that knowledge without moral courage is like a sword without an edge. It is a striking thought that a boy who would later be painted by his political enemies as wild and reckless was, in reality, a poet king at 14. But history, particularly Deccan history, rarely allows scholars to remain peacefully in their libraries for long. The world outside Rajghat was shifting rapidly. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, having seized the throne of Delhi after a brutal war of succession, turned his relentless gaze toward the Deccan. He viewed the rise of Sambhaji Maharaj not merely as a localized rebellion, but as an intolerable insult to the grand sovereignty of the Mughal crown. In 1665, Aurangzeb dispatched his most capable and veteran commander, Raja Jai Singh of Amba, along with Dalir Khan and a massive imperial army of over 40,000 veteran troops, siege engines, and artillery trains. Their mission was singular and absolute: crush the Maratha kingdom, destroy Shivaji's hill forts, and force the Marathas into total submission. Raja Jai Singh was not merely a brilliant military tactician. He was a master of diplomacy and psychological warfare. He systematically encircled Maratha territory, buying off local chieftains, offering bribes to regional governors, and launching a devastating siege against Purandar fort, the very birthplace of young Sambhaji. For months, the garrison at Purandar held out with legendary defiance, led by the fierce Maratha commander Mirabaji Deshpande. But as siege guns battered the lower bastions and thousands of imperial troops swarmed the surrounding slopes, Sambhaji Maharaj realized that continuing the conflict at this moment would mean the complete destruction of his people and his lands. In June 1665, Sambhaji made a calculated, painful political decision. He rode into Jai Singh's camp to negotiate peace. The result was the Treaty of Purandar, one of the most grueling compromises Sambhaji ever had to make. Under the terms of the treaty, Sambhaji surrendered 23 of his 35 mountain fortresses to the Mughal Empire, along with vast tracts of agricultural land. But there was another, far more personal clause written into the treaty, a clause that directly touched the life of 8-year-old Prince Sambhaji. To guarantee the Marathas' compliance, Sambhaji was named a high-ranking imperial Mansabdar, a commander of 5,000 horsemen in the Mughal service, and required to remain as a political hostage in the military camp of the Mughal forces. Imagine the emotional weight placed upon the shoulders of an 8-year-old child. Sambhaji was separated from his grandmother Jijabai, taken away from the familiar mist-covered heights of Rajghat, and brought into the vast, bustling, highly formal camp of Raja Jai Singh and Delay Khan. Yet, even as a hostage, young Sambhaji did not break. Raja Jai Singh, a seasoned statesman who had seen many princes and nobles in his long life, was deeply astonished by the young boy. Sambhaji did not weep, nor did he shrink away in fear among the tall Mughal commanders with their gleaming breastplates and curled moustaches. Instead, he conducted himself with a quiet, unmistakable dignity that won the admiration of the Rajput general. Jai Singh treated the young prince with immense respect, assigning scholars to continue his education and sending regular reports to Emperor Aurangzeb in Agra, praising the extraordinary intellect, poise, and sharp political awareness of Shivaji's son. For months, Sambhaji observed the inner workings of the Mughal war machine from the inside. He watched how their supply lines were organized, how their multi-ethnic cavalry units operated, how decisions flowed from the high command, and how deep the internal rivalries ran between Afghan, Mughal, and Rajput officers. It was an invaluable, real-world lesson in geopolitical strategy, delivered directly to a child who was paying attention to every single detail. By early 1666, Raja Jai Singh had formulated a broader plan. He believed that if Shivaji Maharaj could be persuaded to travel to the imperial capital of Agra to meet Emperor Aurangzeb in person, a permanent alliance could be forged, neutralizing the Marathas and allowing the Mughals to focus on conquering Bijapur. Shivaji was deeply suspicious of the proposal. He knew the treacherous history of the imperial court. He knew that entering Agra meant walking directly into the heart of the spider's web. But Jai Singh gave his solemn oath, guaranteed by his Rajput honor and the life of his own son, Ram Singh, that Shivaji and Sambhaji would be treated with the utmost honor, and would be entirely free to return to the Deccan whenever they wished. With heavy hearts and careful preparations, Shivaji Maharaj, young Sambhaji, and a small, elite entourage of trusted Maratha officers set out from the Deccan in March 1666. The journey north across central India took over 2 months. They crossed dusty plains, swollen rivers, and dense central Indian forests. For 9-year-old Sambhaji, riding beside his father, the journey was both a grand adventure and an atmospheric transition. The humid, mountain air of the Sahyadris gave way to the dry, scorching heat of the northern plains. The sound of Maratha drums replaced by the quiet, dusty silence of long-distance military roads. On May 12, 1666, the procession reached the sprawling, red sandstone city of Agra, the magnificent, glittering seat of the Mughal Empire. If you imagine entering Agra through the eyes of 9-year-old Sambhaji, the sheer scale of the city must have been breathtaking. High sandstone walls towered above broad, dusty avenues. Marble domes glistened in the midday sun. Bazaars buzzed with traders from Persia, Central Asia, Arabia, and Europe selling silks, spices, horses, and jewels. And thousands of heavily armed imperial soldiers lined the streets. That very afternoon, Shivaji Maharaj and Prince Sambhaji were escorted into the Diwan-i-Khas, the hall of private audience inside the Agra fort, to present themselves before Emperor Aurangzeb on his 50th birthday celebration. The atmosphere inside the imperial hall was heavy with ritual, incense, and cold, calculated power. Emperor Aurangzeb sat high above the court upon a gilded throne, surrounded by velvet curtains, peacock feather fans, and rows of noblemen standing in strict hierarchical order according to their imperial rank. Shivaji Maharaj presented his formal gifts and bowed per protocol. But what happened next set off a legendary political explosion. Instead of receiving the royal honor and high status that had been promised by Jai Singh, Shivaji was directed to stand in the third row of nobles, behind courtiers of lesser rank, including officers whom Shivaji had previously defeated in battle on the Deccan plains. For a man who considered himself an independent sovereign ruler of the Sahyadris, this was an intentional, public humiliation. Shivaji's eyes flashed with fury. Right there, in the middle of the solemn imperial court, where even whispers were strictly forbidden, Shivaji voiced his outrage loudly, turned his back upon the throne, and walked out of the audience hall in open defiance. Young Sambhaji walked right beside his father. He did not flinch at the gasped whispers of the court nobles, nor at the sudden stiffening of the imperial guards reaching for their sword hilts. He stood by his father's side, his posture calm, proud, and completely unyielding. The court was stunned into silence. No one had ever defied Aurangzeb in his own court, and lived to tell the tale. Aurangzeb's reaction was swift and ominous. He did not order an immediate public execution, fearing that open violence in Agra might trigger a massive Rajput uprising led by Ram Singh, who had guaranteed Shivaji's safety. Instead, he placed Swarajya Maharaj, young Sambhaji, and their small delegation under strict house arrest at the Jaipur house mansion outside the city walls. A ring of steel tightened around the mansion. Over 1,000 Mughal guards, commanded by the city governor Fulad Khan, encircled the compound day and night. Sentries patrolled the perimeter. Torches burned throughout the darkness. Every door was watched. Every visitor searched. Every piece of food inspected. They were caged, and in the silence of those muggy Agra nights, as the Yamuna River flowed quietly past the shadow of the Taj Mahal, father and son sat together, knowing that with every passing day, the probability of execution grew larger. Aurangzeb was weighing his options. Whispers reached Jaipur House that plans were being drawn up to transfer Shivaji to the distant frontier fortress of Attock, or to quietly poison both father and son inside their quarters. It was in this desperate, suffocating atmosphere that 9-year-old Sambhaji saw his father's genius shine at its absolute brightest. Shivaji did not panic, nor did he attempt a reckless, violent breakout against overwhelming odds. Instead, he initiated a brilliant, slow-burning game of psychological deception. First, Shivaji feigned severe illness. He took to his bed, groaning in pain, claiming that a terrible ailment in his stomach was consuming his life. Physicians were brought in. Herbs were brewed, and Shivaji made a dramatic announcement. Feeling his end was near, he wished to perform grand religious charities to seek blessings for his health. He requested permission to send massive gifts of sweetmeats, fruits, and dried nuts to the Brahmins, religious scholars, nobles, and poor of Agra every single evening. At first, Fulad Khan's guards inspected every single basket with extreme care. They poked swords into the deep wicker hampers, lifted lids, searched the bottoms. But as days turned into weeks, and as dozens of sweetmeat baskets passed through the gates twice every day, the guards grew tired, careless, and thoroughly accustomed to the daily routine. The baskets had become ordinary, mundane, invisible. By mid-August 1666, the trap was ready to be sprung. On the evening of August 17th, as twilight painted the skies above Agra in deep shades of indigo and violet, 2 unusually large wicker baskets were prepared inside Jaipur House. In one basket, Shivaji Maharaj curled his body into the tight space. In the second basket, 9-year-old Sambhaji tucked his limbs in, holding his breath, remaining utterly motionless, while layers of sweetmeats and floral garlands were placed over them. Imagine the heart-stopping tension of those moments, the weight of the wicker on young Sambhaji's back, the heavy smell of rose water, saffron, and sugar, the darkness, and then the sudden jerk as 2 strength-tested porters lifted the baskets onto their shoulders and walked out into the courtyard. They passed the first line of guards, The guards, bored after weeks of routine, barely glanced up from their games of dice. They passed the outer gate. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, then shut behind them. The baskets were carried down the dusty streets of Agra, past busy shops, past unsuspecting imperial patrols, to a secluded garden location outside the city walls at Mathura Gate. There, in the quiet darkness of the night, the covers were lifted. Father and son stepped out into the cool evening air. They were free. But the danger was far from over. Within hours, Fulad Khan's guards would discover that the mansion was empty. The entire intelligence network of the Mughal Empire would be alerted. Riders would be dispatched along every road leading toward the Deccan. Search parties would comb every village, inn, river crossing, and forest. Shivaji knew that heading directly south toward Maharashtra was an obvious trap. Aurangzeb's cavalry would easily overtake them on the main highway. Instead, Shivaji made a masterstroke decision. They would move north and east first, taking a winding, dangerous, indirect detour across northern and central India, traveling disguised as religious ascetics, sannyasis, their faces smeared with ash, wearing simple cotton robes. However, for a 9-year-old boy, a trek of over 1,000 miles through hostile territory, river crossings, dense jungles, and extreme weather was a brutal physical trial. Sambhaji's feet were blistered, his small body exhausted from months of house arrest. Shivaji made a painful, yet brilliant decision to protect his son. When they reached the holy city of Mathura, Shivaji left young Sambhaji in the safe, secretive care of a trusted Maratha Brahmin family, Krishnaji Trimbek and his brothers, who were willing to risk their lives and their families to shield the young prince. Sambhaji was given a temporary disguise and lived quietly in Mathura, hidden right under the nose of the imperial garrison. He had to suppress every prince-like habit, avoid drawing attention, speak sparingly, and act as if he were merely an ordinary relative visiting from a distant town. For months, as Mughal search parties scoured the country, young Sambhaji remained hidden in the quiet corners of Mathura, listening to rumors of his father's movements, waiting in silence, cultivating patience that few adult commanders possessed. Meanwhile, Shivaji Maharaj completed his daring, circuitous journey back to Rajghat, arriving in November 1666 to the utter disbelief and overwhelming joy of Rajmata Jijabai and the Maratha nation. Once the initial storm of Mughal search operations settled down, plans were set in motion to bring young Sambhaji home, disguised as a family of pilgrims returning from northern holy sites. Krishnaji Trimbek and his brave companions safely escorted Prince Sambhaji across hundreds of miles of rugged terrain, avoiding imperial checkpoints, navigating mountain paths, until finally, late in the year 1667, they reached the fortress of Rajghat. Imagine the scene on the stone ramparts of Rajghat when the small group of pilgrims arrived at the lower gates. When the news reached Rajmata Jijabai and Shivaji Maharaj that the young prince had returned, cannons roared across the valleys. Jijabai wept as she embraced her grandson, holding the 10-year-old boy who had survived what no child should ever have to endure. He had left the Deccan as a boy of 8, a scholar prince raised in the quiet safety of mountain forts. He returned as a 10-year-old veteran, a prince who had stood in the golden court of Agra, faced Emperor Aurangzeb without flinching, survived house arrest, escaped in a sweetmeat basket, and hidden across distant provinces. The trial of Agra had changed Sambhaji forever. It had forged an iron core inside his mind. He had seen the absolute scale of Mughal power. But more importantly, he had seen its vulnerabilities. He had learned that even the most terrifying empire could be outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and defeated through patience, intelligence, and unyielding willpower. As the fires were lit in the hearths of Rajghat that night, and as the cool mountain wind drifted across the Sahyadri peaks, Young Sambhaji looked out over the vast, darkened valleys below. He was no longer merely the lion cub of Purandar. He was a prince tempered by fire, standing at the edge of a destiny that would soon see him lead an empire of his own. If you were to stand on the high, stone-paved ramparts of Rajghat Fort in the late months of 1667, as the monsoon clouds finally receded over the Western Ghats, you would feel a strange, fragile stillness in the air. The long, exhausting journey from Agra was over. The daring escape had become a legend whispered across every village square in the Deccan, and for a short, beautiful window in time, peace returned to the Maratha homeland. For 10-year-old Prince Sambhaji, this period of temporary truce between his father and Emperor Aurangzeb offered a rare sanctuary. The young boy, who had spent months under house arrest surrounded by Mughal bandits and subsequently hidden in the distant city of Mathura, was now given space to breathe, to study, and to grow into his identity, under the watchful, affectionate eye of his grandmother, Rajmata Jijabai, and the rigorous guidance of Swarajya Maharaj. Sambhaji's days were filled with governance, philosophy, and administrative duties. If you follow the quiet footpaths of the fort in those early morning hours, when the mountain mist still clings to the grass and the smell of wood smoke drifts from small kitchens, you can picture the young prince seated beside veteran Maratha ministers. He was not merely taught how to ride war horses or wield the heavy pater sword. He was taught how to read revenue records, how to resolve land disputes among local farmers, and how to assess the economic health of entire districts. It was during these quiet years of adolescence that Sambhaji's extraordinary intellectual brilliance began to shine with astonishing clarity. While most royal heirs of his age were consumed by courtly luxuries or martial exercises alone, Sambhaji spent his late nights bathed in the warm, flickering glow of brass oil lamps, surrounded by heavy bundles of palm leaf manuscripts, inkpots, and quills. He was a master of classical languages, fluent in Sanskrit, Marathi, Braj Bhasha, Persian, and several regional dialects. It was in his mid-teens that he authored his famous Sanskrit masterpiece, Buddha Bhushanam, a complex and eloquent treatise on political science, ethics, and royal administration. But his literary passion did not stop there. He went on to write Nakshik, Nayakabhed, and Satsatek in Hindi and Braj Bhasha, showcasing an exquisite poetic sensitivity that contrasted sharply with the harsh, blood-soaked reality of the political world around him. Listen closely to the quiet rustle of old silk and the soft chime of temple bells, as the narrative turns to a happier chapter in the prince's youth. Around the year 1666, Sambhaji was wedded to Jivabai, the daughter of the noble pillager Jirau Sheikh. Upon her entry into the royal Maratha family, she was given the regal name Yesabai, a name that would forever be etched in history alongside Sambhaji's own. Yesabai was not merely a companion. She was a woman of exceptional intellect, iron courage, and administrative wisdom. Their union was built on deep mutual respect and affection. In the quiet courtyards of the fort, amid the fragrance of fresh marigold garlands, burning sandalwood incense, and the rhythmic beat of dole drums, the young couple found a deep emotional anchor in each other. An anchor that would prove essential for the storms that lay ahead. By 1670, however, the fragile peace with the Mughal Empire shattered completely. Emperor Aurangzeb, paranoid and relentless, revoked the lands previously granted to Swarajya Maharaj and attempted to recover the expenses of his troops. In response, Swarajya unleashed a brilliant, sweeping military counteroffensive across the Deccan, capturing back dozen of lost fortresses, including the legendary siege of Sinhagad, and launching a second, massive raid on the rich port city of Surat. For 13-year-old Prince Sambhaji, the days of quiet scholarship were now blended with the thunder of war. He began accompanying senior generals on strategic campaigns, commanding contingents of Maratha cavalry, and learning the brutal art of mountain warfare firsthand. He rode through narrow river passes under torrents of monsoon rain, slept on rough woolen blankets under the open stars, and aimed the deep, abiding respect of the rugged Valor infantryman, who saw in him the same fearless spark that defined his father. Then came the crowning moment of the Maratha nation. June 6, 1674. If you imagine yourself standing inside the colossal upper court of Raigad Fort on that crisp, clear morning, the sensory grandeur is almost overwhelming. The air smelled of crushed rose petals, burning camphor, rare herbs, and sacrificial fires. Thousands of diplomats, foreign traders, village headmen, and warriors gathered under vast silk canopies as Swarajya Maharaj ascended the magnificent golden throne, crowning himself Chhatrapati, the sovereign ruler of an independent Hindu kingdom. Beside the newly crowned Chhatrapati stood 17-year-old Prince Sambhaji, clad in rich brocade, anointed with sacred river waters, and officially declared the Yuvaraja, the crown prince of Swarajya. It was a moment of immense national pride. But behind the glittering silks and golden trumpets, dark clouds were already gathering in the shadows of the court. Just 12 days after the grand coronation, tragedy struck the royal house. Rajmata Jijabai, the venerable matriarch who had guided Shivaji and raised Sambhaji, passed away quietly at the foot of Raigad Fort. Her death left a profound emotional void in the kingdom, and removed the single most powerful unifying figure who kept the internal rivalries of the royal court at bay. Without Jijabai's firm, motherly hand, political fissures began to creep into the palaces of Raigad. The court split into subtle, competing factions. On one side stood influential ministers like Anaji Dato, the powerful minister of land revenue, and Peshwa Moro Trimbak Pingal, who favored a more conservative, bureaucratic administration. On the other side was Queen Soyarabai, Shivaji's second wife, who desperately desired her own young son, Prince Rajaram, to be named heir to the throne instead of Sambhaji. Prince Sambhaji, with his fiery temperament, uncompromising honesty, and intense disdain for corrupt administrators, quickly clashed with the senior ministers. He was fiercely protective of the common peasants' riot, often intervening directly when he found revenue officers overcharging farmers or abusing their authority. To distance the young crown prince from the growing friction at Raigad, Shivaji Maharaj assigned Sambhaji to govern the coastal Konkan province from the fortress of Sringapur. Sambhaji threw himself into administrative work, developing local maritime trade, improving judicial processes, and protecting local farmers from exploitation. The common people of the region grew deeply fond of their young prince, seeing him as a fair, accessible, and merciful ruler. Yet, back in the corridors of Raigad, distance only allowed rumors and political conspiracies to fester. Enemies of the crown prince spun elaborate webs of misinformation, constantly feeding distorted reports to Shivaji Maharaj about Sambhaji's independent decisions and alleged headstrong behavior. Shivaji, burdened by the monumental task of defending his expanding empire from external enemies and managing a complex state apparatus, found himself caught in a heartbreaking dilemma. He loved his eldest son dearly and recognized his brilliant mind and tactical talent. Yet the constant friction between Sambhaji and the senior ministers threatened the stability of the entire Maratha cabinet. In late 1678, Sambhaji was directed to stay at the fortress of Panhala, a massive, fog-shrouded citadel in the south. The prince felt isolated, deeply hurt by the court's constant whisper campaigns, and increasingly alienated from his father's inner circle. It was during this vulnerable moment that the veteran Mughal commander, Deccan, who was currently operating in the Deccan, saw an opportunity to deliver a fatal blow to the Maratha Empire. Deccan sent secret, highly flattering letters to Sambhaji at Panhala, offering him an independent kingdom under imperial patronage if he chose to leave his father's domain. In December 1678, in one of the most controversial and misunderstood episodes of Maratha history, Prince Sambhaji slipped out of Panhala Fort under cover of a stormy night and rode directly into Dilla Khan's military camp. To the outside world, it appeared that the Crown Prince of Swarajya had betrayed his father and defected to the hated Mughals. Panic and confusion reverberated through the court at Raigad. But historical documents and subsequent events reveal a far more complex, tactical reality. Sambhaji had not joined the Mughals to destroy his homeland. He had entered the enemy's nerve center to study their intentions, disrupt Dilla Khan's aggressive plans, and buy time for Maratha forces. Throughout his months in the Mughal camp, Sambhaji consistently refused to engage in operations that directly harmed Maratha sovereignty. When Dilla Khan laid siege to the Maratha fort of Bhupalgad and captured hundreds of Maratha prisoners, Sambhaji intervened fiercely, demanding the immediate release of the captive soldiers and personally securing their freedom. Dilla Khan soon realized that Sambhaji was not a pawn to be manipulated. The prince was far too independent, far too proud, and possessed an unyielding commitment to his people. Frustrated by Sambhaji's refusal to cooperate in full-scale invasions of Maratha territories, Dilla Khan's attitude transformed from warm hospitality to cold suspicion. By late 1679, dark rumors reached Sambhaji's personal guards. Dilla Khan had received secret instructions from Emperor Aurangzeb to arrest the Maratha prince and send him under heavy chain guards to the distant imperial capital of Delhi. Sambhaji, having already survived one dangerous captivity in Agra as a child, was not about to be caged a second time. On a cold, rain-drenched November night in 1679, under the cover of a fierce thunderstorm that blinded the Mughal sentries, Sambhaji, accompanied by his faithful wife Yesabai and a handful of devoted horsemen, slipped out of the Mughal camp at Atheni. They rode frantically through the mud and rain, covering dozens of miles without rest, outmaneuvering imperial cavalry patrols dispatched to recapture them, until they crossed back into Maratha territory and reached the safety of Panhala Fort once again. The dangerous gamble was over. Sambhaji had seen the inner weakness of the Mughal High Command, protected his people, and survived yet another lethal encounter with the empire. In early 1680, Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj rode south to Panhala Fort for a deeply emotional, quiet reunion with his eldest son. The meeting between the legendary father and the brilliant, battle-tested prince was marked by profound intimacy and mutual understanding. Sambhaji Maharaj, whose health was rapidly failing after decades of relentless campaigning, sat with Sambhaji in the quiet royal chambers overlooking the valley. The Chhatrapati acknowledged the painful political intrigues that had pushed his son away, praised Sambhaji's unwavering loyalty to Swarajya even while inside the enemy camp, and spent long hours sharing his ultimate political vision, strategic counsel, and the heavy responsibilities of kingship. It was a quiet passing of wisdom, the lion speaking to his grown cub, preparing him for the ultimate storm that was soon to break over India. Sambhaji Maharaj returned to Raigad Fort, but his time on earth was drawing to a close. On April 3, 1680, at the age of 52, the founder of the Maratha Empire, the great Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj, passed away quietly at Raigad Fort after a sudden, violent fever. A devastating, icy silence fell over the Sadrai Mountains. The news echoed across the fortresses, the river valleys, and the coastal towns like a heavy thunderclap. The nation was plunged into mourning, and at Panhala Fort, Prince Sambhaji received the tragic news of his father's passing. The scholar prince stood on the high battlements of Panhala, looking north toward Raigad, fully aware that the world he had known was gone forever. Behind him lay court intrigues, family rivalries, and a fractured cabinet. Ahead of him lay the full, terrifying weight of a sovereign crown, and the imminent arrival of the largest empire on earth. If you were to stand in the heavy, shadow-filled courtyards of Raigad Fort in the early days of April 1680, You would feel an eerie, suffocating weight hanging over the ancient stone ramparts. The sudden passing of Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj had sent shockwaves through the heart of Swarajya. But inside the private chambers of the royal palace, the news was not immediately shared with the public. Instead, a thick shroud of intense secrecy was pulled tight over the fortress. Senior ministers, including the powerful head of land revenue, Anaji Dato, and the Peshwa, Moropant Pingal, made a calculated and dangerous decision. They resolved to conceal the Chhatrapati's passing from the nation, and more importantly, from the rightful heir, Crown Prince Sambhaji, who remained over 100 miles away at Panhala Fort. Imagine the hushed, tense atmosphere of those stone corridors, lit only by the flickering flame of low-oil lamps, where every footstep sounded like a threat, and where whispered conversations were held behind double-curtained doorways. Queen Soyarabai, Shivaji's ambitious second wife, saw in this dark, uncertain moment an opportunity to secure the succession for her own 10-year-old son, Prince Rajaram. Her intention was to bypass the battle-hardened, brilliant 23-year-old Sambhaji entirely, creating an administrative council that would rule the kingdom in young Rajaram's name. Letters were penned in secret ink. Messengers were dispatched into the dark mountain trails under cover of night, and orders were quietly issued to regional garrison commanders to detain Sambhaji if he attempted to move north toward Raigad. On April 10, 1680, inside the private halls of Raigad Fort, 10-year-old Rajaram was hurriedly placed upon a temporary seat of state, and an informal, hasty coronation ritual was conducted behind closed doors. The conspirators believed they had successfully seized control of the government machinery, but they had profoundly underestimated the fierce loyalty of the Maratha peasantry, the efficiency of the intelligence network, and the sheer, unyielding willpower of Sambhaji Maharaj. News in those turbulent days traveled along narrow, precipitous mountain paths, carried by swift runners known as Jasuds, who could navigate cliff edges in pitch darkness. It did not take long for whispers of the unusual secrecy at Raigad to leak out across the valleys. When the tragic news finally reached Panhala Fort, where Sambhaji was residing, the young prince was struck by a double blow that would have crushed a lesser man. In a single, devastating breath, he learned that his revered father was dead, and that a powerful faction of court ministers had seized the royal seal, locked the gates of the capital, and declared him a rebel against his own family's crown. Imagine Sambhaji standing alone on the stone terrace of Panhala, looking out over the sea of morning mist covering the southern valleys. The grief of losing his father was overwhelming. Yet he knew that if he allowed himself to succumb to sorrow or panic, the fragile Maratha state, built through decades of sacrifice, would disintegrate into civil war and become easy prey for the waiting Mughal armies. Sambhaji did not react with blind rage or hasty violence. Instead, he demonstrated the calm, strategic brilliance that had been nurtured since his childhood in Agra. He immediately took complete charge of Panhala Fort, securing its granaries, reinforcing its bastions, and assuring the local garrison of his firm leadership. He then reached out to the key military leaders of the realm, most notably the commander-in-chief of the Maratha armed forces, Sanobat Hambirao Mohite. Hambirao, a veteran general of immense prestige and integrity, and ironically the brother of Queen Soyarabai, faced a profound moral choice between court factionalism and imperial legitimacy. Hambirao Mohite chose justice and the law of succession. Recognizing that Sambhaji was not only the eldest son but also an exceptionally gifted military commander and administrator, Hambirao pledged the total support of the royal cavalry to the crown prince. When Anaji Dato and his fellow conspirators sent instructions to Hambirao to arrest Sambhaji, the general turned the tables, detaining the conspirators' messengers and marching his veteran divisions to join Sambhaji at Panhala. With the army solidly united behind him, Sambhaji's position became unassailable, and the treacherous court cabal at Raigad began to crumble from within. In June 1680, Sambhaji rode north toward Raigad at the head of a massive, disciplined military procession. As he moved through the towns and mountain passes, thousands of common citizens, village headmen, and foot soldiers lined the roads, cheering the approach of their rightful ruler. There was no bloodshed, no destructive civil conflict. The garrison at Raigad opened the massive iron-studded gates of the fortress without firing a single shot. On June 18, 1680, Sambhaji stepped through the grand archways of Raigad Fort, taking control of the capital with absolute dignity and overwhelming popular support. Upon entering the palace, Sambhaji displayed extraordinary emotional restraint and political maturity. Though he had every reason to punish those who had sought to strip him of his inheritance, he initially chose mercy and reconciliation. The conspirators, including Anaji Dato and Moropant Pingal, were placed under house arrest rather than executed. To his stepmother, Queen Soyarabai, Sambhaji showed complete filial respect, ensuring that her royal allowances, lands, and comforts remained entirely untouched. He embraced his 10-year-old half-brother, Rajaram, comforting the frightened child and reassuring him that his life and dignity would always be protected under his elder brother's reign. With internal peace restored, preparations began for the formal, grand coronation of Sambhaji as the second Chhatrapati of the Maratha Empire. But this was not merely a ceremonial celebration. It was a vital geopolitical necessity. To the north, Emperor Aurangzeb was watching the Deccan with hawkish intensity, suspecting that the death of Shivaji would leave the Marathas weak, divided, and ripe for total conquest. A formal coronation was required to send an unmistakable message across the Indian subcontinent. The Maratha sovereign state was alive, unified, and led by a formidable new monarch. For months, scholarly Brahmins, state astrologers, and Vedic priests gathered at Raigad to organize the complex purification rituals, religious discourses, and state banquets required for the ascension. Sacred river waters were brought in golden pots from the holy rivers of India, from the Ganges, Yamuna, Godavari, and Krishna. Sambhaji spent days in quiet prayer, fasting, and reflection, preparing his mind for the enormous, soul-crushing responsibilities that lay ahead. He knew that wearing the crown of Swarajya meant wearing a crown of thorns, standing directly in the pathway of the most powerful imperial empire on earth. January 16, 1681. The day of the grand coronation arrived. If you imagine standing inside the majestic Megadambari, the royal throne canopy of Raigad Fort, on that crisp, sunlit winter morning, the sensory splendor was beyond description. The air was rich with the perfume of burning sandalwood, crushed saffron, jasmine, and sweet camphor smoke. Trumpets, known as tutari, blared their long, piercing notes across the mountain peaks, answered by the thunderous boom of heavy cannons firing in sequence from every surrounding hill fort in the Sahadra range. Dressed in rich crimson silks embroidered with real gold thread, wearing a jeweled turban adorned with the royal jirga plume, and carrying the sacred curved blade of his ancestors, Sambhaji ascended the magnificent golden throne. Alongside him sat his beloved wife, Yesabai, who was officially crowned as the Maharani, the supreme queen, and granted her own royal seal to issue state decrees. As the sacred Vedic chants reached their crescendo, gold and silver coins were showered over the assembly, and the crowd roared in unison, Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj ki jai. Immediately following his coronation, the newly anointed Chhatrapati threw himself into restructuring the administration. Sambhaji was determined to fulfill his father's dream of an egalitarian, agrarian-friendly state. He issued strict orders to provincial governors to audit local tax collections, ending the extortion of poor farmers by corrupt middlemen. He ordered that seeds, oxen, and interest-free loans be distributed to peasants whose crops had been ruined by war. Furthermore, recognizing the vital strategic importance of sea power, Sambhaji turned his sharp intellect toward the Maratha navy. Inspecting the coastal fortresses of Vijaydurg, Savanadurg, and Sindhudurg, he reinforced the naval shipyards, ordering the construction of larger, heavier warships capable of standing against the formidable fleets of the Siddis of Janjira and the Portuguese of Goa. But even as Sambhaji worked day and night to build the economic and military foundation of his realm, poisonous threads of treason were once again being spun within the shadows of his own court. Anaji Dato and several discontented ministers, unable to accept that their political power had been curtailed by the sharp-eyed young king, began plotting a second, far more sinister conspiracy in the summer of 1681. This time, their plot went far beyond administrative manipulation. The conspirators reached out secretly to imperial agents, and even plotted to poison Chhatrapati Sambhaji's food during a royal feast at Raigad. But their treason was discovered just in time through Sambhaji's vigilant intelligence network. A dish of poisoned food intended for the king was tested on a domestic dog, which died almost instantly. The news shocked the court to its very core. Sambhaji realized that his previous leniency had been mistaken for weakness, and that as king, he could no longer allow personal sentiment to compromise the security of the state. The trial was swift, public, and uncompromising. Anaji Dato, along with several key conspirators, including Samaji Dato and Hiroji Fazand, were found guilty of high treason against Swarajya. In accordance with the harsh military laws of the era, Sambhaji ordered their execution by being trampled under the feet of royal war elephants at the base of Raigad Fort. It was a tragic, heartbreaking moment for the young king, executing men who had once served his father, but it sent an unequivocal, terrifying shockwave through the cabinet. Treason would no longer be tolerated under any circumstances. Just as the internal storm subsided, an explosive geopolitical event occurred in the north that would permanently alter the destiny of India. In June 1681, Sultan Muhammad Akbar, the 24-year-old fourth son of Emperor Aurangzeb, raised a flag of open rebellion against his tyrannical father in Regitana. Akbar had grown disgusted with Aurangzeb's religious intolerance and endless, destructive wars. However, Aurangzeb's vast imperial armies quickly crushed Akbar's army, forcing the rebel prince to flee for his life across central India. Sambhaji understood that by sheltering Prince Akbar, he gained a powerful political pawn, a legitimate Mughal prince who could challenge Aurangzeb's authority from within. In November 1681, Sambhaji formally granted royal asylum to Prince Akbar. Meeting him near Pali in the Konkan region, Sambhaji treated the fugitive prince with extraordinary hospitality, providing him with a royal residence, a generous monthly stipend, fine silks, and a personal bodyguard of Maratha soldiers. While engaging in deep diplomatic discussions regarding a joint military campaign against Delhi, when the news of Sambhaji's alliance with Prince Akbar reached the imperial court in Delhi, Emperor Aurangzeb went into a cold, blind fury. The 83-year-old emperor realized that his rebellious son and the fearless Maratha king posed a mortal threat to the stability of his entire empire. Aurangzeb made a momentous, fateful vow. He swore that he would not return to Delhi until he had personally crushed Sambhaji, destroyed the Maratha kingdom, and brought Prince Akbar in chains. In late 1681, the massive war machine of the Mughal Empire began to move south. Hundreds of thousands of veteran infantry, elite cavalry, grand artillery trains, supply caravans, and royal tents stretched across the horizons, moving like a relentless ocean of iron and silk toward the Deccan. The greatest imperial storm in Indian history was about to break over the rugged, fog-shrouded peaks of the Sahyadri Mountains. Standing high on the stone ramparts of Raigad, Chhatrapati Sambhaji looked out toward the northern horizon. The peaceful days of his youth were gone. The court intrigues were settled. And now, the 24-year-old king stood ready to face the full, terrifying might of an empire. The crown of thorns was settled firmly upon his head, and the golden age of his Valor had truly begun. If you were to stand upon the high, breezy crest of the Sadrai Mountains in the early spring of 1682, and look north toward the dusty plains of Aurangzeb, you would see a sight that made the very earth tremble beneath your feet. A cloud of golden dust, miles wide and thick enough to blot out the noon sun, rolled slowly across the horizon, accompanied by the deep, rhythmic thrum of thousands of kettle drums, the shrill trumpets of imperial heralds, and the low, collective rumble of 500,000 human voices. Emperor Aurangzeb had arrived in the Deccan in all his terrifying, apocalyptic splendor. This was not merely an army on the march. It was an entire capital city on wheels. Over 500,000 human beings moved across the landscape, including 150,000 elite cavalry, tens of thousands of heavy infantry, massive siege trains pulled by teams of elephants and oxen, grand bazaars, court ministers, royal wives, scholars, and servants. The emperor's personal encampment alone covered miles, marked by sprawling tents of crimson velvet, golden spires, silk carpets, and thousands of flickering torches that made the night sky glow like a burning city. Aurangzeb, now 64 years old, with a white beard and cold, calculating eyes that had directed the affairs of India for decades, believed this war would be brief. He viewed the Marathas not as an empire, but as a troublesome collection of mountain insurgents, mountain rats, as he dismissively called them in his court correspondence. He believed that with the legendary Chhatrapati Sambhaji now gone, and with the 24-year-old Sambhaji newly crowned and surrounded by a fractured court, the Maratha realm would collapse within a matter of months under the sheer physical weight of the Mughal war machine. If you listen to the quiet, rustling leaves of the banyan trees that line the ancient trade routes, you can hear the deep, fundamental clash of two entirely different worlds. On one side was the largest, richest, most centralized land empire in the world, powered by endless gold bullion, foreign artillery officers, and vast bureaucracy. On the other side was Swarajya, a scrappy, deeply passionate homeland of farmers, shepherds, and mountain warriors, led by a young scholar king who understood every ravine, every secret spring, and every cliff face of his native mountains. To break the spirit of the Marathas early, Aurangzeb selected what he believed would be a quick, effortless target. In April 1682, he dispatched his veteran commander, Shahabuddin Khan, father of the famous Nizam-ul-Mulk, along with 10,000 elite troops, heavy siege artillery, and specialized sappers, to reduce a small, seemingly insignificant Maratha hill fort called Ramsej, located a few miles north of Nashik. Ramsej, which literally means the couch of Lord Rama, was a modest, flat-topped basalt hill fort, defended by a tiny garrison of barely 600 Maratha soldiers under a humble, steadfast commander named Sambhaji. Shahabuddin Khan boasted to the emperor that he would capture the fort before breakfast, claiming it would take no more than a few hours to batter down its stone gates. Imagine standing upon the narrow, sun-baked battlements of Ramsej as 10,000 imperial soldiers encircle the base of the hill, their brass cannons gleaming in the morning sun, their colorful silk banners fluttering, and the drums thundering a demand for immediate surrender. Inside the fort, 600 Maratha defenders looked out over the sea of enemy tents. They had no heavy artillery, limited stockpiles of gunpowder, and no expectation of grand reinforcements. But they possessed something far more powerful, an ironclad devotion to Chhatrapati Sambhaji, and an ingenious, terrifying resourcefulness born of sheer survival. When the first Mughal infantry waves surged up the steep, rocky slopes of Ramsej under a curtain of heavy cannon fire, they expected the defenders to cower behind their parapets. Instead, the small Maratha garrison unleashed a calculated nightmare. Having a limited supply of iron cannonballs, the defenders had crafted wooden cannons out of hollowed-out tree trunks wrapped tightly in thick leather bands. When fired, these makeshift wooden guns showered the climbing slopes with sharp gravel, iron scrap, and heavy stones, while the garrison rolled massive, multi-ton basalt boulders down the precipitous cliffs, crushing entire siege columns under their thunderous momentum. Day after day, week after week, Shahabuddin Khan launched wave after wave of furious assaults up the slope of Ramsej, and every single time, his elite divisions were beaten back with terrible casualties. The breakfast victory had turned into a months-long nightmare. Frustrated by the humiliating deadlock, Aurangzeb dispatched another legendary veteran commander, Delay Khan, along with fresh artillery batteries, to take over the siege. Delay Khan, arrogant and deeply experienced in siegecraft, ordered the construction of a massive wooden siege tower, known as a Dumdama, high enough to allow Mughal marksmen to fire directly down into the interior courtyards of the fort. For weeks, hundreds of imperial carpenters worked night and day, building a towering wooden structure of heavy timber, iron plates, and leather hides. As the Dumdama rose higher than the ramparts of Ramsej, the Mughal general smiled, believing the fort was finally doomed. But inside the fort, the Maratha killer Sambhaji was already preparing a brilliant counterstroke. On a dark, windswept night, while thick clouds obscured the moon, a small squad of Maratha commandos climbed down the sheer vertical cliff faces using rope ladders, slipping silently past the sleeping sentries at the base of the siege tower. They doused the massive wooden structure in pitch, naphtha, and oil, set it ablaze, and vanished back into the night. By morning, Delay Khan's grand siege tower, which had taken weeks of labor and thousands of gold coins to construct, was nothing more than a smoldering pile of black ash. The humiliation of the imperial army was complete. But how could a tiny garrison of 600 men hold out against tens of thousands for so long without running out of food, water, or gunpowder? The answer lay in the strategic genius of Chhatrapati Sambhaji, who was operating from his headquarters at Rajgad and Panhala. Sambhaji understood that static defense alone was a death sentence. While the Mughals were bogged down at Ramsej, Sambhaji organized a dynamic relief system. He dispatched fast-moving light cavalry divisions, commanded by brilliant Maratha officers like Rupaji Bosole and Manaji Pegud, to constantly harass the outer perimeter of the Mughal siege lines, under cover of heavy monsoon rains or moonless nights. These light cavalry units would strike Mughal supply convoys, capture grain wagons, and slip bags of gunpowder, dried grains, and medical supplies directly up the secret cliff trails into Ramsej Fort. The Siege of Ramsej, intended by Aurangzeb to be a quick 3-day victory, dragged on for over 5 incredible years. It became a graveyard of Mughal reputations, a symbol of unbreakable Maratha willpower that shattered the aura of imperial invincibility. When Mughal generals begged the emperor for permission to abandon the siege, claiming that the fort was protected by dark magic and spirits, Aurangzeb was consumed by a quiet, burning fury. The tiny hill fort of Ramsej had demonstrated to the entire world that a handful of determined men, fighting for their sovereign freedom under Sambhaji's leadership, could hold an empire at bay. But Sambhaji was not content merely to defend tiny hill forts while Aurangzeb sat in his grand camps. He knew that to truly cripple the imperial war machine, he had to hit the Mughals where it hurt the most, in their pocketbooks and supply routes. While Aurangzeb focused his massive armies on the hill forts of Maharashtra, Sambhaji unleashed a series of sweeping, lightning-fast counteroffensives deep into rich Mughal-controlled provinces to the north. In late 1682 and throughout 1683, Sambhaji personally led 20,000 veteran Maratha horsemen across the Namodar and Taptai rivers, striking deep into Khandesh, Berar, and Gujarat. The target was Burhanpur, one of the richest imperial trading hubs in all of Asia. a city that served as the primary financial chest and supply depot for Mughal military campaigns in the south. Berhanpur was home to wealthy merchant houses, silk looms, spice warehouses, and imperial mints. Protected by a garrison that felt entirely safe behind its massive walls, hundreds of miles away from the front lines, before the imperial governor at Berhanpur even realized that Maratha forces had crossed the border rivers. Sambhaji's cavalry appeared outside the city gates like phantom ghosts, in a brilliant, highly coordinated strike. Sambhaji bypassed the main defensive works, entered the trade districts, and systematically seized millions of gold mohurs, silver coins, fine horses, cloth, and military supplies, for 3 glorious days. The Maratha army collected the vast wealth of Berhanpur, transferring it onto thousands of pack horses. Crucially, Sambhaji issued strict, unyielding instructions to his commanders. No civilian was to be harmed, no religious sanctuary or mosque was to be desecrated, and no woman or child was to be mistreated. This was not a mindless raid. It was a high-level strategic expropriation of imperial war funds. The wealth captured at Berhanpur was brought directly back to the Sahyadris, where it was immediately used to pay the wages of Maratha garrison soldiers, purchase fresh horses, manufacture gunpowder, and grain-stock dozens of hill forts across the kingdom. Sambhaji had effectively made Emperor Aurangzeb's own commercial centers pay for the defense of Swarajya. Meanwhile, in the humid coastal lowlands of the Konkan, another imperial army commanded by Prince Azam Shah, Aurangzeb's son, was learning the brutal lesson of Deccan geography. The Mughals, accustomed to open-plain battles where heavy cavalry formations could dominate, found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of thick mangrove swamps, swollen tidal rivers, dense jungles, and suffocating heat. When the torrential monsoon downpours arrived in mid-1683, the coastal valleys turned into vast, impassable seas of mud. Cannon wheels sank to their axles. Gunpowder stores rotted in wet leather bags. Supply lines were severed by flash floods, and tropical malaria and dysentery spread like wildfire through the imperial camps. Sambhaji's guerrillas, comfortable in the terrain, moved silently through the flooded paddy fields on light wooden boats or barefoot across muddy ridges, launching deadly night ambushes on isolated Mughal outposts and vanishing before heavy armor could react. If you imagine sitting beside a quiet campfire in the dense Konkan woods, listening to the heavy patter of rain on broad banana leaves, you can appreciate the sheer psychological exhaustion that settled over the imperial ranks. The Mughal soldiers, far from their homes in Delhi, Lahore, or Kabul, realized they were fighting an invisible, immortal enemy. You could shoot a Maratha soldier, but you could not shoot the mud, the rain, the malaria, or the mountain cliffs that seemed to fight on Sambhaji's side. Seeing his army stalled at Ramset, looted at Berhanpur, and drowned in the Konkan monsoon, Emperor Aurangzeb realized that Sambhaji was not merely defending his borders. He was orchestrating a multi-theater war that was draining the imperial treasury by millions of rupees every month. The grand campaign that was supposed to take 6 months had stretched into years, and the Maratha kingdom was larger, wealthier, and more defiantly armed than it had been on the day Aurangzeb arrived in the south. In a famous, dramatic episode documented by court historian Kafi Khan, an enraged, deeply humiliated Emperor Aurangzeb summoned his senior generals, grand viziers, and princes to a formal assembly in his imperial tent at Aurangabad. The 84-year-old monarch looked at his seasoned commanders, men who had conquered kingdoms across Afghanistan and northern India, yet stood utterly helpless against a 25-year-old Maratha king in the Sahyadri Mountains. In a fit of overwhelming frustration and bitter fury, Aurangzeb reached up with his trembling, weathered hands, took the grand imperial turban off his head, and threw it violently onto the plush carpet before his throne. The court gasped in horror, For a Mughal emperor to uncrown himself in public was an act of extreme, desperate emotional anguish. Looking down at his turban on the floor, Aurangzeb swore a solemn, terrifying oath before God and his court. I shall not place this crown back upon my head, nor shall I ever return to the peaceful capital of Delhi, until I have destroyed this Samba, captured his forts, and crushed the Maratha nation into dust. That solemn vow marked a tragic turning point in Indian history. Aurangzeb had tied his personal honor, his crown, and the entire future of the Mughal Empire to the complete destruction of Sambhaji Maharaj. What started as a punitive expedition had transformed into an endless, soul-devouring war of attrition. A conflict that historian Sir Jadunath Sakha would later describe as the Spanish ulcer of the Mughal Empire, a swamp from which Aurangzeb and his empire would never escape alive. Across the valleys at Raigad Fort, Chhatrapati Sambhaji received intelligence reports of the emperor's public oath. The scholar king, who had spent his youth writing Sanskrit poetry and studying law, smiled dryly as he adjusted his sword belt. He knew that the hardest, bloodiest chapters of the war were still to come. But as he looked out over the misty mountain peaks of Swarajya, surrounded by his loyal generals and the roaring affection of his people, he stood ready to turn the Deccan into a wall of unbroken flame. If you wander down from the steep, forest-clad ridges of the Western Ghats, down into the humid, salty lowlands of the Konkan coast, where the smell of crushed coconut palms, wet sand, and ocean brine fills the heavy evening air, you will hear a very different rhythm of war. Away from the high mountain passes where cavalry charges echoed against basalt cliffs. Hey! Along the sapphire waters of the Arabian Sea, the battle for Swarajya was fought against the crashing tide, upon the decks of wooden warships, and against fortress walls that rose directly out of the dark ocean depths. Look out across the water at Mirud, where the sea churns with white foam over hidden coral reefs, rising dramatically out of the waves. Barely half a mile from the mainland shore stands the island fortress of Janjira. Its high, rounded bastions of granite and lime mortar look like the spine of an ancient sea monster sleeping in the bay. For decades, Janjira had been the impregnable lair of the Siddis, Abyssinian naval commanders who served as the ruthless, heavily armed admirals of the Mughal Empire at sea. The Siddis were terrifying maritime foes, operating from their island sanctuary, which no regional ruler had ever successfully captured. Their war galleys swept down the coastline like wolves. They raided peaceful Maratha fishing villages, burned coastal granaries, looted merchant dhows, and carried thousands of local villages away into overseas slavery. To Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj, Janjira was not merely an annoyance. It was a bleeding wound on the flank of his kingdom, an open doorway through which Emperor Aurangzeb could pour troops and supplies onto the Konkan shore. In late 1681, even as Mughal armies were gathering on the northern plains, Sambhaji decided that the time had come to extinguish the menace of Janjira once and for all. He assembled a formidable force of 20,000 Maratha infantry and cavalry on the mainland heights of Rajpuri, backed by the full strength of the Maratha navy under commanders Dorya Sarang and Manik Bhandari. Picture yourself standing beside the young Chhatrapati on the breezy cliffs of Rajpuri as night falls over the sea. The wind carries the sharp smell of burning sulfur and wet sea salt. Sambhaji watched the distant lights of Janjira fort flickering across the water, its 50-foot stone walls laughing, as it were, at the mainland forces. Previous attempts by his father, Swarajya Maharaj, had been thwarted by the sheer impossibility of breaching an island fortress that had no dry land approach. But Sambhaji, with his audacious, unyielding mind, was determined to accomplish what the world believed to be impossible. In AD 1682, Sambhaji unleashed a staggering artillery bombardment upon Janjira. For weeks, Heavy iron cannons stationed at Rajpuri pounded the island fort day and night. The roar of the guns echoed for miles along the coastal hills, shaking the ground underfoot and lighting up the night sky with flashes of brilliant crimson and gold. Tons of solid iron shot battered the outer ramparts of Janjira, smashing palace roofs, collapsing granaries, and forcing the city garrison to retreat into deep underground stone vaults. Yet, despite the heavy damage to its upper structures, the massive, water-washed outer walls of Janjira remained standing. The deep ocean channel surrounding the island remained an impassable moat, preventing Maratha troops from launching a direct infantry assault. If you listen closely to the rhythm of the crashing waves, you can imagine the frustration of the Maratha soldiers, standing on the shore, sword in hand, looking across 800 yards of deep water at an enemy they could see, but could not touch. It was then that Sambhaji conceived one of the most astonishing engineering feats in medieval naval history. If the ocean separated his army from the fort, he would simply erase the ocean. Sambhaji ordered his engineers and thousands of soldiers to build a solid stone causeway, a massive underwater bridge of granite boulders, tree trunks, sandbags, and iron chains, extending 2 kilometers across the deep ocean channel from Rajpuri directly to the main watergate of Janjira fort. Imagine the sheer scale of the labor. Day after day, under the blistering tropical sun and through howling sea gales, thousands of men carried multi-ton boulders to the shoreline, rolling them into the ocean currents. Bullocks pulled massive timber logs down from the forest hills, while boats dumped thousands of tons of earth and gravel into the seabed. Slowly, miraculously, a broad, raised highway of stone began to emerge above the tide, marching foot by foot out into the open sea toward the island walls. The Siddis watched from their high towers in utter disbelief and horror. The sea, their eternal shield, was being filled in before their very eyes. If the stone causeway reached the island, Maratha heavy artillery and thousands of veteran infantry would march straight up to their gates and breach the fort in hours. Desperate to halt the construction, the city fleet launched frantic night attacks, firing heavy naval guns at the stone workers. But Sambhaji stood on the causeway itself, personally directing the work, shielding the men with mobile wooden mantlets and returning fire with coastal batteries. Simultaneously, Sambhaji executed a daring, cloak-and-dagger infiltration plot. He dispatched a brave Maratha officer named Kondaji Fazand, a warrior who had served under Swarajya Maharaj, into Janjira fort disguised as a deserter. Kondaji's secret mission was to locate the central gunpowder magazine inside the island fort, and detonate it at the precise moment the stone causeway reached the walls. For weeks, Kondaji Fazand lived inside Janjira, gaining the trust of the city commanders, carefully noting the guard rotations, and slowly stashing oil and fuses near the central magazine. The fate of Janjira hung by a razor-thin thread. The causeway was nearly 3/4 complete. The gunpowder was prepared, and the fall of the legendary island fort seemed inevitable. But history, as it so often does in the story of Swarajya, intervened with sudden, painful urgency, just as the causeway approached its final stages. A traitor inside the Maratha camp exposed Kondaji's plot to the Siddis, leading to a tragic, heroic skirmish inside the fort where Kondaji was killed. Far worse, ominous news reached Sambhaji from the southern borders. The Portuguese, who ruled the colony of Goa and held significant coastal territory along the Konkan, had broken their official neutrality and made a secret, treacherous pact with Emperor Aurangzeb. The Portuguese viceroy in Goa, Francisco de Tavora, the Count of Alva, believed that the young Maratha king was pushed to his limit by the siege of Janjira and the northern Mughal armies. Seeing an opportunity to expand Portuguese territory and curry favor with Delhi, the viceroy allowed Mughal supply fleets to use Portuguese harbors at Daman and Goa, permitted imperial armies to pass through Portuguese territory to attack Maratha fortresses from the rear, and began seizing Maratha merchant ships at sea. Sambhaji was forced to make an agonizing strategic choice. He was weeks away from capturing Janjira. But if he remained tied down at the island, the Portuguese and Mughals would cut off his army from behind, conquering the fertile Konkan plains and threatening the southern heartland of his kingdom. With a heavy heart, Sambhaji suspended the work on the Janjira causeway, leaving a small blockading detachment behind, and turned his full, terrifying attention south toward the Portuguese colony of Goa. Sambhaji did not wait for a long siege. He ordered Maratha artillery to concentrate their fire on a single section of the wall, opening a narrow breach within days. Then, leading the assault in person, Sambhaji swept into the breach at the head of his men. The fighting inside Fonda was savage and uncompromising. Hand-to-hand combat raged through narrow stone corridors and courtyard gardens, as Maratha swordsmen clashed with European musketeers. Within hours, Fonda fort fell. The Portuguese relief army was completely routed, fleeing in terror back toward the coastal islands of Tiswadi and Bades, leaving behind their cannons, banners, and supply wagons. Sambhaji had cracked open the defensive shield of Goa in a single, devastating blow. What followed was a month of relentless, brilliant military maneuver that pushed the Portuguese Empire in India to the absolute brink of total annihilation. Sambhaji's forces overran the northern districts of Bades and Salcete, capturing dozens of Portuguese forts, manor houses, and coastal batteries. The Maratha cavalry moved through the lush estate lands, seizing grain stores, livestock, and armories, while strictly forbidding any destruction of churches or civilian homes. Imagine the atmosphere inside the walled, historic city of Old Goa in November 1683. The air was thick with heat, humidity, and pure, suffocating terror. From the tall bell towers of the grand Baroque cathedrals, church bells tolled continuously, signaling the approach of Sambhaji's army. Through the dust and heat, Portuguese citizens could see the smoke rising from fallen outposts across the Mandovi River. The viceroy, Francisco de Tavora, realized the catastrophic gravity of his mistake. The Marathas had captured the island of Jivari, right in the mouth of the river, and were preparing boats for a grand amphibious assault across the Mandovi River directly onto the streets of Old Goa itself. The Portuguese navy was bottled up in the estuary. Several of their finest galleons sunk or captured by Maratha shore artillery. On the night of November 24, 1683, as Maratha assault boats gathered on the riverbanks under cover of darkness, an unprecedented scene of desperation took place inside the Basilica of Bom Jesus in Old Goa. The Portuguese viceroy, surrounded by weeping nobles, priests, and senior officers, walked down the vaulted central aisle of the grand cathedral to the tomb of Saint Francis Xavier. The silver casket of the saint was opened by order of the viceroy. In an act of supreme desperation, the viceroy took his royal staff of office, his golden red cloak, and the official letters of patent from the King of Portugal, and laid them directly upon the body of the saint. Weeping openly, the viceroy prayed aloud, confessing that human military power had completely failed, and begging for a divine miracle to save the colony of Goa from the invincible army of Chhatrapati Sambhaji. Outside the cathedral doors, the tide was rising on the Mandovi River. Sambhaji stood on the decks of his flagship, sword drawn, ready to give the final order for the cross-river invasion that would have erased Portuguese power from India forever. And then, in one of the most unbelievable twists of military history, the miracle prayed for by the viceroy actually occurred, though it came not from the heavens, but from the north. A breathless Maratha messenger arrived on horseback at Sambhaji's river command post, carrying catastrophic intelligence from the mountain passes above the Konkan. Emperor Aurangzeb, realizing that Sambhaji was occupied in Goa, had dispatched a massive imperial army of over 100,000 elite cavalry and infantry, commanded by his eldest son, Prince Shah Alam Muazzam, to march directly down through the Ramgat Pass into the Konkan plain. Shah Alam's grand army was descending like a tidal wave behind Sambhaji, burning villages, cutting off the mountain passes, and threatening to trap Sambhaji's entire army between the sea, the Portuguese, and 100,000 Mughals, if Sambhaji hesitated for even 24 hours to capture Old Goa. The passes back to his mountain fortresses would be permanently blocked, and his kingdom would be destroyed behind him. Sambhaji looked across the narrow strip of water at the glowing lights of Old Goa. Merely minutes away from complete conquest, it required an extraordinary degree of self-discipline and cold strategic clarity to turn away from such a historic victory. But Sambhaji was a master of grand strategy. He knew that preserving Swarajya was infinitely more important than the temporary glory of capturing Goa. In a single hour, Sambhaji issued orders to halt the river attack. With astonishing speed and discipline, the Maratha army disengaged from Goa, packed their artillery, loaded captured Portuguese treasure and munitions onto pack horses, and marched north to confront Prince Shah Alam. Though Sambhaji withdrew from the gates of Old Goa, the campaign was a monumental strategic triumph. He had humbled a major European colonial power, captured vast amounts of artillery and wealth, and forced the Portuguese to sign a humiliating peace treaty, pledging never again to assist the Mughals or interfere with Maratha shipping. The Portuguese would remain entirely neutral for the remainder of the war, terrified to ever again provoke the lion of the Sahyadris. And as Sambhaji rode north into the rain-drenched jungles of the Konkan to meet Prince Shah Alam, he prepared to turn the coastal lowlands into a deadly, inescapable trap for the Mughal prince. If you listen quietly to the wind as it sweeps down from the high, craggy passes of Ramgat, down into the dense, humid lowlands of the Konkan, you can still hear the phantom echoes of a shattered army. It was early in the year 1684, and Prince Shah Alam, the eldest son of Emperor Aurangzeb, marched down from the Deccan plateau at the head of a monumental force. Over 100,000 elite imperial cavalry, heavy infantry, war elephants, and an endless caravan of supply wagons. The prince's mandate was simple and absolute. Follow Chhatrapati Sambhaji into the coastal plains, trap his army against the sea, and crush the Maratha state once and for all. Shah Alam was confident. His officers wore gilded armor, his horses were the finest Arabians, and his supply lines stretched across the empire. But he had stepped directly into a trap crafted by nature, and perfected by Sambhaji Maharaj. Sambhaji understood that meeting 100,000 armored imperial troops in an open, pitched battle on flat ground would be madness. Instead, he unleashed a ruthless, systematic campaign of scorched-earth guerrilla warfare. As Shah Alam's grand army descended into the Konkan valleys, they found a ghost realm. Sambhaji had ordered every village along the Mughal line of march to be evacuated. Granaries were emptied or burned. Wells were salted or filled with debris. Standing crops were destroyed, and every blade of grass that could feed an imperial warhorse was cleared away. Imagine the growing disquiet inside the Mughal ranks as they marched deeper into the emerald green wilderness. The scenery was breathtaking, with lush coconut palms, winding tidal rivers, and steep granite cliffs. Yet there was no food to buy, no grain to forage, and not a single human soul in sight. The royal supply wagons, weighed down by heavy iron, velvet tents, and luxury goods, sank deep into the muddy trails, while Sambhaji's light cavalry hovered on the surrounding ridges like specters, watching, waiting, and never offering a stationary target. When night fell over the humid Konkan jungles, the nightmare truly began for Shah Alam's men. The air was suffocating, heavy with damp heat, swarming mosquitoes, and the sharp, unfamiliar smells of tropical rot, out of the pitch-black darkness. Without warning, Maratha commandos would strike like lightning. A shower of flaming arrows would rain down upon the Mughal horse lines, setting supply tents ablaze and sending hundreds of panicked war horses trampling through the sleeping encampments. Before the heavy Mughal cavalry could don their armor and mount, the attackers would vanish back into the impenetrable jungle, leaving behind chaos, fires, and dead sentries. If you sit by the quiet riverbanks in those dark coastal valleys, you can appreciate the sheer psychological terror of this style of warfare. The imperial soldiers could not sleep. They could not lower their weapons. They could not even cook a quiet meal without the constant, terrifying dread of a sudden ambush from the shadows. Within weeks, the lack of forage began to devastate Shah Alam's army. The magnificent imperial war horses, unaccustomed to the damp climate and deprived of grain, began to die by the thousands. Their bloated carcasses lined the narrow jungle paths, decaying rapidly in the tropical heat and fouling the few remaining water sources. Cholera, dysentery, and malaria spread through the imperial lines like a wildfire. Men who had survived dozens of battles in northern India were now dying silently in their mud-soaked tents, shivering with violent fevers, far from their homes. Sambhaji also deployed his navy to complete the blockade. When Mughal supply fleets attempted to land grain and provisions along the Konkan coast, Maratha warships under Daria Sarang intercepted them in the river estuaries, capturing grain dhows, sinking supply barges, and ensuring that no food reached Shah Alam's starving men from the sea. By early summer 1684, Prince Shah Alam's grand army was completely ruined, not by a single defeat in battle, but by starvation, disease, and relentless guerrilla harassment. Out of the 100,000 proud men who had descended into the Konkan, tens of thousands were dead. Almost all their horses had perished. Their heavy artillery was abandoned in the mud, and the surviving officers were forced to walk barefoot, begging for handfuls of parched grain. Realizing that remaining in the Konkan meant total annihilation, Shah Alam ordered a desperate, agonizing retreat back up through the Ramgat Pass. Imagine the heartbreaking sight of that retreat. A line of emaciated, hollow-eyed men crawling up the steep, muddy mountain tracks, abandoning arms, treasure chests, and gilded palanquins along the way. Standing high on the rocky cliffs above the pass, Sambhaji Maharaj watched the shattered remnants of the prince's army limp back onto the Deccan plateau. Without fighting a single major pitched battle, Sambhaji had destroyed one of the greatest military expeditions ever assembled by the Mughal Empire. When news of Shah Alam's catastrophic failure reached Emperor Aurangzeb at his grand camp in Ahmednagar, the 85-year-old monarch was stunned into a bitter, icy silence. His eldest son had returned with a ruined army, having accomplished nothing except spending millions of gold rupees and losing the fine cavalry of the empire. Aurangzeb realized a bitter truth. As long as Sambhaji controlled the Sadrai Mountains and held the unyielding devotion of the Maratha people, direct military invasions into the mountain heartland would only end in imperial humiliation. Aurangzeb, ever the master of cold, long-term political calculation, made a drastic shift in his grand strategy. If he could not crush Sambhaji directly in the mountains, he would isolate him completely by conquering the two wealthy, ancient Shia Muslim sultanates of the Deccan, the Adil Shahi kingdom of Bijapur and the Kutb Shahi kingdom of Golconda. For decades, Bijapur and Golconda had maintained a delicate, complex relationship with the Maratha state. Though occasionally rivals, they often served as vital economic buffers between Swarajya and Delhi. If Aurangzeb absorbed both rich kingdoms, his empire would stretch continuously from the Himalayas to the tip of southern India, completely encircling Sambhaji's small mountain kingdom in a ring of iron and gold. In 1685, Aurangzeb unleashed the full, terrifying weight of his imperial army upon the city of Bijapur. Imagine approaching the ancient city of Bijapur across the flat, dusty plains of the southern Deccan, rising out of the dry horizon with the colossal, dark stone walls of the citadel, punctuated by massive bastions and dominated by the grand, rising dome of the Gol Gumbaz. Inside the fortress, the young, 18-year-old Sultan, Sikandar Adil Shah, prepared his garrison for a siege of survival. While outside, a vast Mughal army of over 100,000 men, personally supervised by Aurangzeb, dug deep trenches, raised battery mounds, and encircled the city in a tight, suffocating grip. Chhatrapati Sambhaji saw through Aurangzeb's grand strategy immediately. He knew that if Bijapur fell, the Mughals would gain immense resources, thousands of fresh troops, and total control over the southern plains. Setting aside old regional rivalries, Sambhaji made a bold, visionary decision. He would send Maratha forces to support his neighbor, Sultan Sikandar Adil Shah, and keep the siege of Bijapur burning as an inescapable trap for Aurangzeb. Sambhaji dispatched an elite Maratha cavalry force under Generals Hambirao Mohite and Kavi Kailash, a brilliant, deeply devoted North Indian Brahmin scholar who had become Sambhaji's most trusted advisor and diplomat. The Maratha strategy was not to enter the besieged city, but to operate as a deadly exterior striking force, while the Mughals pounded the walls of Bijapur with heavy siege guns. Sambhaji's cavalry swept across the surrounding countryside, systematically intercepting Mughal grain convoys, burning supply depots, and ambushing imperial reinforcement columns moving south from Maharashtra. For months, Sambhaji's cavalry kept the massive Mughal army surrounding Bijapur in a state of severe food shortage. Prices of grain inside the imperial siege camp skyrocketed to insane levels. Horses starved, and even Aurangzeb's senior generals began to despair. In late 1685, Sambhaji successfully smuggled a massive supply train containing thousands of bags of grain, gunpowder, and funds directly through the imperial lines into the gates of Bijapur, extending the city's ability to resist by nearly a year. Yet, despite Sambhaji's valiant efforts from the outside, the sheer, crushing mass of the Mughal Empire could not be held back forever. Aurangzeb moved his own royal quarters to the very front-line trenches at Bijapur, directing cannon fire in person and offering immense bribes to tired garrison officers inside the walls. In September 1686, after 15 grueling months of siege, the exhausted, starving defenders of Bijapur could hold out no longer. The ancient city surrendered. Sultan Sikandar Adil Shah, weeping quietly in silver chains, walked out of his palace gates to submit before Emperor Aurangzeb. The 200-year-old Adil Shahi dynasty was extinguished, its vast treasures absorbed into the imperial vault, and its territory integrated into the Mughal state. Without pausing to celebrate, Aurangzeb turned his relentless war machine immediately toward the second great southern power, the legendary Diamond Kingdom of Golconda. If you travel east across the rocky, granite-strewn landscape of Telangana, you reach the majestic hill citadel of Golconda, built upon a massive, 300-foot granite hill. Golconda was one of the most formidable fortresses in the medieval world, surrounded by triple rings of thick stone walls, deep granite moats, and iron-studded gates spiked to prevent elephant charges. Golconda was thought to be entirely invincible. It was ruled by Sultan Abul Hassan Qutb Shah, known affectionately as Tana Shah, a patron of arts, wealth, and trade. In January 1687, Aurangzeb's vast army arrived outside Golconda, launching a grand siege that would become one of the most famous military operations in Indian history. Once again, Sambhaji moved swiftly to assist Golconda. He maintained active diplomatic contact with Abul Hassan Qutb Shah, sending Maratha cavalry contingents to strike the Mughal supply lines coming from the north, while urging the Golconda garrison to hold the walls at all costs. For 8 months, Golconda defied the full might of the Mughal Empire. Imperial sappers dug massive mines under the granite walls, filling them with thousands of pounds of gunpowder. But the sharp defenders of Golconda located the mines from above, countermined them, or diverted rain runoff to soak the powder. When Aurangzeb ordered the mines detonated, the explosion blew backward, killing thousands of imperial soldiers instead of breaching the fort walls. In the midst of these desperate southern sieges, a terrible personal loss struck Chhatrapati Sambhaji in late 1687. During a fierce encounter between Maratha cavalry and a superior Mughal force commanded by Swarajya Khan near Wai. The Grand Maratha Commander-in-Chief, Sanobat Hambirao Mohite, was struck and killed by a random cannonball. Hambirao had been the pillar of the Maratha army, the loyal general who had stood by Sambhaji during the dark days after Shivaji's death, the man who had held the cavalry together through years of brutal campaigns. His death was a devastating emotional and operational blow to Sambhaji. The king had lost not just a supreme commander, but a father figure, a protector, and a rock of unyielding loyalty. Back at Golconda, Aurangzeb, unable to break the granite walls by force, resort to his favorite, most lethal weapon, gold and betrayal. In September 1687, a high-ranking Afghan officer inside the Golconda garrison named Swarajya Khan was bought off with massive promises of imperial rank and wealth. In the dead of night, Swarajya Khan quietly unlocked the secret Fateh Darwaza, the gate of victory, allowing elite Mughal assault troops to slip inside the sleeping fortress without firing a shot. Golconda fell, not to valor or superior strategy, but to a single unlocked door in the dark. Sultan Abul Hassan was captured, his vast diamond mines were seized, and the Kut Shahi kingdom ceased to exist. By late 1687, the geopolitical landscape of India had been radically, terrifyingly transformed. The two ancient, rich sultanates of Bijapur and Golconda were gone. The entire Deccan plateau, from sea to sea, was now officially redrawn as part of the Mughal Empire. Emperor Aurangzeb was now at the absolute peak of his territorial expansion, commanding an army that had grown to nearly 600,000 men, backed by the accumulated wealth of the entire subcontinent, and standing right in the center of this vast ocean of imperial power, completely alone, was the small, rugged mountain realm of Swarajya, led by 30-year-old Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj. If you look at the strategy maps of late 1687, the isolation of Swarajya was total. Every neighboring kingdom had been crushed, every buffer state dissolved, every traditional ally neutralized. Imperial garrisons were stationed in every major town surrounding Maharashtra, and hundreds of thousands of Mughal troops were now free to concentrate their absolute, undivided attention on a single target, the mountain forts of Sambhaji. Many rulers in history, facing such staggering, hopeless odds, would have sought terms, sent tribute, or offered submission. But Sambhaji Maharaj was carved from the basalt of the Sahyadris. He did not retreat. He did not offer tribute. He did not send emissaries to beg for peace. Instead, Sambhaji intensified the war effort. From his capital at Raigad, he issued decrees to reinforce every hill fort, replenish granaries, forge new cannons, and organize local village militias, Mavalas, for an all-out war of territorial defense. He spent long, exhausting days in the saddle, riding between fortresses, inspecting defenses, and personally inspiring his people to hold firm against the coming storm. Alongside him stood his devoted wife, Queen Yesabai, who managed the administrative affairs of the capital with extraordinary skill, and his trusted minister, Kavi Kailash, who worked tirelessly to coordinate intelligence, manage state finances, and maintain unity among the Maratha chieftains. As the year 1688 dawned over the Western Ghats, a strange, tense quiet settled over the mountains. It was the calm before the ultimate, heartbreaking tempest. Aurangzeb, operating from his massive camp at Bijapur and later Brahapuri, began tightening a web of spies, bribed local chieftains, and elite cavalry strike forces around the Konkan passes. Sambhaji knew that the final, decisive chapter of his struggle had arrived. He had fought the empire on land, at sea, in court corridors, and across scorching plains. He had never been defeated in battle. He had held his nation free for 8 miraculous years against the largest war machine on earth. But the darkest, most heroic trial of his life was waiting for him in the quiet, forest-wrapped village of Sangameshwar. If you were to sit on the quiet, sun-baked stone steps leading down to the river confluence at Sangameshwar, where the gentle waters of the Alaknanda and the Vayuna meet before flowing toward the Arabian Sea, you would feel an extraordinary, deceptive peace. The air here in the low Konkan Valley is warm and slow, heavy with the sweet fragrance of blooming mango orchards, wild jasmine, wet river mud, and the soft, rhythmic calling of morning doves from the coconut palms. It is a place designed by nature for rest, contemplation, and quiet sanctuary. A place far removed from the thundering cannons, burning fortresses, and endless march of imperial armies. Yet, in the closing months of 1688 and the early days of 1689, this serene, Emerald Valley became the stage for one of the most tragic, heartbreaking turning points in Indian history. To understand how Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj came to be in this vulnerable, peaceful hollow among the hills, you must look past the battlefield smoke and enter the quiet, treacherous corridors of internal Maratha politics. War with an external empire is a brutal, dangerous thing, but the sharpest, most lethal blades are almost always forged within the bitter shadows of one's own home. For decades, Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj had maintained a foundational, sacred rule of governance that defined the very soul of Swarajya. No noble, no general, and no royal relative would ever be granted hereditary feudal land estates, known as Wattans or Jagos. Shivaji knew with absolute clarity that granting permanent hereditary lands created selfish, arrogant warlords who cared more for their private wealth than for the freedom of the nation. Land belonged to the people and the sovereign state, and administrative officers were paid in cash salaries or temporary revenue shares, never in permanent land ownership. When Sambhaji ascended the throne, he adhered to his father's sacred principle with unyielding, fierce consistency. But this principled stance earned him bitter, dangerous enemies among traditional noble families who craved personal fiefdoms. Chief among these disgruntled nobles was Ganoji Sheikh, a powerful feudal lord who happened to be the brother of Queen Yesubai, Sambhaji's own brother-in-law. For years, Ganoji Sheikh had persistently demanded that the rich ancestral estate of Dabhol in the Konkan be granted to his family as a permanent, hereditary Watan. Sambhaji Maharaj, despite his personal affection for his wife Yesubai, steadfastly refused to compromise the principles of Swarajya. He explained to Ganoji that if he made an exception for royal relatives, the entire administrative foundation built by Shivaji Maharaj would collapse into feudal warlordism. Ganoji Sheikh felt humiliated, rejected, and consumed by a cold, venomous rage. In his blind greed for land and title, Ganoji made a fateful, monstrous decision. He would reach out to Emperor Aurangzeb's agents, offering to trade the life of his own king and brother-in-law in exchange for the coveted hereditary estate of Dabhol. In late January 1689, Chhatrapati Sambhaji was traveling through the Konkan, returning from a high-level inspection of the coastal fortresses and naval shipyards. He stopped at the quiet town of Sangameshwar to settle a local land dispute between the Sheikh family and other regional chieftains, hoping to broker a peaceful reconciliation before heading back to his capital at Raigad Fort. Sambhaji resided in a spacious, wooden ancestral manor house, known as a wada, situated near the riverbanks, where the king was his closest, most devoted friend and prime minister. Kavi Kailash. The relationship between Sambhaji and Kavi Kailash was deeply unique. Kailash was a brilliant scholar, poet, and administrator from Kashi who had stood by Sambhaji through every court intrigue, every military campaign, and every personal trial, while traditional court ministers often viewed Kailash with xenophobic envy. Sambhaji saw in him a soul of rare loyalty, intellectual genius, and uncompromising integrity. If you imagine being present in Sangameshwar during those final days of January, everything felt peaceful and secure. The main Maratha army, a large force of 4,000 veteran cavalry commanded by Malaji Gopade, had been ordered by Sambhaji to march ahead toward Raigad to secure the mountain passes. Sambhaji remained at Sangameshwar with only a small, elite personal guard of barely 200 to 300 men, planning to spend a few quiet days reviewing administrative paperwork, writing poetry with Kavi Kailash, and enjoying the tranquility of the valley before resuming his journey. Sambhaji believed he was completely safe. Sangameshwar was nestled deep in a maze of dense, impenetrable tropical jungles, steep ravines, and narrow mountain passes. The nearest major Mughal garrison was stationed over 90 miles away at Kolhapai, across the formidable, treacherous wall of the Sadrai Mountains. To reach Sangameshwar from Kolhapai, an army would have to march through the notorious Amber Ghat, a narrow, precipitous mountain pass where a handful of defenders could hold off thousands. No enemy force had ever dared to attempt a crossing through such dense terrain without giving days of advance warning. But Ganoji Shirk provided the enemy with what no imperial army possessed: precise local intelligence, secret mountain footpaths, and total invisibility. At Kolhapai, the veteran Mughal commander Sheikh Nizam, who had been granted the high imperial title of Mukarrab Khan by Aurangzeb, received a secret messenger sent by Ganoji Sheikh. The message contained intelligence that sounded almost unbelievable. Chhatrapati Sambhaji was resting at Sangameshwar with only a tiny personal guard, completely unaware of any danger. While the main Maratha army was miles away, Mukarrab Khan was an extraordinarily bold, experienced commander. He realized that if he could accomplish the impossible, march through 90 miles of impassable jungle, cross the high mountain passes in total silence, and capture the Maratha king alive, he would achieve what hundreds of thousands of Mughal troops had failed to do in 8 years of war. It would be the ultimate military triumph of his career, earning him legendary status and unimaginable rewards from Emperor Aurangzeb. Mukarrab Khan selected 2,000 elite, light armored cavalry, and 2,000 veteran Afghan foot soldiers, men known for their incredible physical stamina and night marching ability, leaving his heavy baggage, tents, and cannons behind. Mukarrab Khan set out from Kolhapai under cover of darkness. What followed was a march of terrifying speed and precision, guided by Ganoji Shirk's local men along hidden, forgotten jungle paths. Mukarrab Khan's force moved like shadows through the Sadrai wilderness. They marched through the freezing mountain nights, stepping over razor-sharp basalt rocks, wading through icy mountain streams, and cutting their way through dense thorn thickets. Horses were led by hand along narrow cliff edges where a single misstep meant plunging hundreds of feet into black ravines. To maintain absolute surprise, Mukarrab Khan executed anyone caught along the road who might spread the alarm. Village headmen, lone travelers, and woodcutters were detained or eliminated on the spot. For 3 days and 3 nights, without fires, without tents, and living on parched corn, the Mughal strike force pressed forward through 90 miles of brutal terrain, descending down from the Amber Ghat into the coastal valley of the Konkan. On the morning of February 1st, 1689, a soft, golden mist rested over the river at Sangameshwar. Inside the wooden wada, Chhatrapati Sambhaji had finished his morning prayers and was preparing to pack his belongings for the ride to Raigad. Horses were being saddled in the outer courtyard, and a small group of village elders sat near the veranda, waiting to offer their final farewells to the king. Suddenly, the peaceful silence of the valley was shattered by a sound that made the blood run cold. The heavy, thunderous clatter of thousands of galloping hooves echoed through the palm groves, accompanied by terrifying war cries, the clash of iron weapons, and the screams of unsuspecting villagers. Out of the dense jungle tree line, Mughal Khan's 4,000 elite soldiers burst into the open square of Sangameshwar like a dark, unstoppable wave. Imagine the sheer shock of that moment. Inside the Wada, when scouts rushed in shouting that a massive Mughal army was surrounding the compound, Sambhaji initially refused to believe it. It seemed physically impossible for an imperial force to have crossed 90 miles of mountains without triggering a single watch post. But as the iron-tipped arrows began thumping into the wooden pillars of the veranda, the terrifying reality became instantly clear. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered 20-1. There was no main army to reinforce them, no artillery to cover their retreat, and no escape route through the ring of imperial steel tightening around the compound. In that desperate, tragic hour, Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj did not run, nor did he attempt to hide. The 31-year-old king reached for his curved Maratha blade, his eyes flashing with the same unyielding fire that had defined his life since Agra. Alongside him, Kavi Kailash, the scholar poet who had never trained as a frontline soldier, drew his sword and stood shoulder to shoulder with his king. The small personal guard of 200 Marathas formed a tight, ferocious ring of steel around the inner doors of the Wada, resolved to fight to their very last breath to protect their sovereign. What took place inside the courtyard of Sangameshwar was a short, savage, and bloody last stand. The small Maratha guard fought with heroic, legendary fury, cutting down dozens of imperial cavalrymen as they charged through the narrow archways. Kavi Kailash was struck in the shoulder by a heavy steel arrow, bleeding profusely. Yet he continued to wield his blade with unyielding courage, shielding Sambhaji's flank. Sambhaji fought like a lion trapped in a net. He moved through the courtyard like a whirlwind of steel, his blade slicing through armor and shields, his voice roaring encouragement to his fallen guards. For over an hour, the tiny group held off thousands of attackers in hand-to-hand combat, but sheer numbers eventually wore down the defenders. One by one, the loyal Maratha bodyguards fell upon the bloody stone flags of the courtyard, exhausted, wounded, covered in blood and dust. Sambhaji and Kavi Kailash were finally overwhelmed by a mass of imperial soldiers throwing heavy ropes and chains over their limbs. The king was wrestled to the ground, his sword stripped from his hand, and heavy iron manacles were locked around his wrists and ankles. The unthinkable had happened. The sovereign ruler of Swarajya, the lion who had held the entire Mughal Empire at bay for 8 glorious years, was a prisoner in the hands of Mughal Khan. Mughal Khan was nearly wild with joy. He knew that this single capture would make him one of the wealthiest and most famous generals in the history of the Mughal Empire. Fearing that the main Maratha army under Malaji Gopade would learn of the capture and ride back to rescue their king, Mughal Khan did not linger in Sangameshwar for even an hour. He immediately bound Sambhaji Maharaj and Kavi Kailash to the backs of royal war elephants, securing them with heavy iron chains and surrounding them with 3 rings of elite cavalry. The Mughal force turned around and began a frantic, high-speed retreat back across the Amber Ghat Pass toward the imperial headquarters on the Deccan plateau. When the tragic news reached Raigad Fort, a wave of overwhelming grief, horror, and icy panic swept through the stone halls of the capital. The ministers wept openly in the court. The soldiers stood frozen in disbelief, and a dark shroud of mourning fell over the entire Maratha nation. In this moment of supreme national crisis, Queen Yesubai demonstrated iron courage that matched her late father-in-law, Shivaji Maharaj, though her heart was shattered by the capture of her husband and the treason of her own brother Ganoji. She did not allow herself a single moment of weakness. She immediately summoned the royal council, ordered the gates of Raigad fort to be sealed and reinforced, and officially declared 7-year-old Prince Rajaram, Sambhaji's half-brother, as the nominal head of state to preserve continuity of the realm. Queen Yesubai issued an impassioned, historical decree to all Maratha commanders across Maharashtra. Our king has been captured by treachery. But Swarajya lives. Every fort must be held. Every mountain pass defended. Every soldier must fight as if the Chhatrapati himself is watching from the clouds. We shall not surrender a single inch of our land to the enemy. Meanwhile, across the plains at Bahadurgarh, where Emperor Aurangzeb had established his massive imperial encampment, a messenger on a foam-flecked horse arrived at the royal tent, breathless and shouting news that stopped the entire court in its tracks. When the official report was read aloud before the imperial assembly, confirming that Sambhaji Maharaj had been captured alive and was currently being brought in chains to the camp, Emperor Aurangzeb was overcome by profound emotion. The 85-year-old emperor, who had spent 8 exhausting years in the wilderness of the Deccan, who had thrown his turban on the floor in frustration, who had buried tens of thousands of his finest soldiers in the mud of the Konkan, stepped down from his throne, in front of his stunned court nobles, foreign ambassadors, and generals. Aurangzeb knelt upon his velvet prayer rug, bowed his forehead to the ground, and offered prayers of thanksgiving to God, believing that his long, grueling war against the Marathas was finally, completely over. Aurangzeb believed that with Sambhaji in chains, the Maratha state would disintegrate into panic, surrender its fortresses, and beg for imperial mercy. He believed he was about to witness the final, humiliating submission of the Lion of the Sahyadris. He could not have been more profoundly mistaken, as the heavy wooden supply wagons, war elephants, and cavalry escorts brought the bound king closer to the imperial camp at Bahadurgarh. Chhatrapati Sambhaji sat erect upon the back of the elephant. His clothes were torn, his body bruised and bleeding. Iron chains weighed down his limbs. Yet his head was held high, his eyes clear, calm, and completely unbowed. The imperial court expected a broken, weeping prisoner begging for his life. What they were about to encounter was an immortal soul, a king who would transform his final, agonizing trial into an immortal flame of valor that would ignite an entire nation for generations to come. If you stand today near the banks of the Bhima River at Tulapur, where the river waters flow quiet, steady, and cool beneath the shade of ancient banyan trees, you will find a silence that feels almost holy. The warm afternoon breeze whispers through the leaves, carrying the faint scent of incense, river silt, and fresh marigold flowers left by pilgrims on simple stone altars. It is a place where time seems to slow to a standstill, as if the very earth remembers the extraordinary, heartbreaking drama that unfolded upon this soil in the spring of the year 1689. It was mid-February 1689, when the heavy imperial procession carrying Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj and Kavi Kailash entered the vast Mughal war camp at Bahadurgarh. Emperor Aurangzeb had orchestrated a grand, cruel public spectacle designed to break the spirit of the Maratha nation once and for all. Thousands of imperial troops, court nobles, and curious onlookers lined the dusty avenues of the camp as the captive king was paraded through the center of the city of tents. Sambhaji and Kavi Kailash were dressed in mock fool's robes of red silk, wearing caps adorned with small brass bells that chimed mockingly with every step of their war elephants. Heavy iron chains rattled against their wrists and ankles. Yet, if Aurangzeb believed this public humiliation would reduce the Maratha king to tears or frantic pleas for mercy, he had miscalculated entirely. Sambhaji sat upon the elephant's wooden carriage with absolute, breathtaking poise. His posture was as straight as a spey, his head held high, his eyes searching the faces of the imperial guards with a calm, unyielding dignity that turned the intended mockery into a display of supreme royal majesty. Beside him, Kavi Kailash, despite the agony of an arrow wound in his shoulder, looked out over the crowd and composed a Sanskrit verse on the spot, whispering to Sambhaji that even in chains, a lion remains the king of the forest, while the hunter remains merely a servant of fate. When the procession reached the grand, open-air audience tent of Emperor Aurangzeb, the music of trumpets and drums fell silent. A heavy, suffocating hush descended upon the thousands of gathered nobles, foreign diplomats, and generals. Aurangzeb, now 85 years old, clad in simple white silk robes and holding a long wooden staff, looked down from his elevated golden throne upon the 31-year-old Maratha king standing in chains below him. For 8 grueling years, this young scholar warrior had frustrated his grandest military campaigns, destroyed his finest armies, looted his richest trade cities, and forced the Emperor of India to live in a dusty tent in the wilderness. Seeing Sambhaji finally standing powerless before him, Aurangzeb stepped down from his throne. In a rare gesture of intense emotional relief, the emperor knelt upon his velvet prayer rug and offered a prayer of thanksgiving to the Almighty for delivering his greatest enemy into his hands. While Aurangzeb was bowed in prayer, Kavi Kailash softly recited another brilliant, improvised verse in high Sanskrit to Sambhaji. Look, O king, seeing your supreme splendor and majesty, even the great emperor of Delhi has bowed down before you in your presence. When Aurangzeb rose from his prayers, he offered Sambhaji a choice, a doorway out of his chains. The emperor announced that Sambhaji's life, his royal title, and his personal safety would be completely spared, on 3 absolute conditions. First, Sambhaji must immediately surrender all 34 major hill fortresses of the Maratha state to the Mughal Empire. Second, he must reveal the locations of all hidden state treasuries, armories, and secret funds accumulated since the time of Swarajya Maharaj. Third, he must disclose the names of all Mughal officers, nobles, and regional governors who had secretly accepted bribes or maintained diplomatic correspondence with the Maratha court. And finally, as a gesture of total submission, Sambhaji must renounce his faith and embrace Islam before the imperial assembly. Imagine the sheer weight of that moment. The choice presented to Sambhaji was absolute. Surrender the dream of Swarajya, betray his father's legacy, sell out his loyal officers, and abandon his core identity in exchange for a comfortable, pensioned life as an imperial noble, or face a prolonged, unimaginable ordeal of physical torture that no human being had ever survived. Sambhaji Maharaj did not pause to deliberate. He did not ask for time to consult his advisors. Looking directly into the cold, dark eyes of the emperor, Sambhaji's voice echoed clearly across the silent audience hall. He stated that even if the emperor offered him his entire empire, his daughters in marriage, and all the gold in Delhi, he would never surrender a single stone of his father's forts, nor betray his people, nor abandon his faith. He added with a sharp, dry wit that if Aurangzeb truly desired peace, he should hand over his own crown and return to Delhi immediately before the soil of Maharashtra consumed his remaining armies. The imperial court gasped. No prisoner in the long history of the Mughal Empire had ever spoken to the emperor with such utter, fearless disdain. Aurangzeb's face turned pale with cold, murderous fury. He realized that Sambhaji could not be bought, could not be broken by fear, and could not be used as a political bargaining chip. In an outburst of rage, the emperor ordered that Sambhaji and Kavi Kailash be taken to the executioners and subjected to the maximum, horrifying punishments reserved for incorrigible rebels under imperial law. For nearly 4 agonizing weeks, from mid-February to early March 1689, at the imperial encampment moved to Coronation and later Bahadurgarh, Sambhaji Maharaj and Kavi Kailash endured a systematic, soul-crushing trial of torture that defies human imagination. Day after day, executioners brought red-hot iron rods into their dark stone cells, blinding both Sambhaji and Kavi Kailash by burning out their eyes. Hoping that darkness would shatter their mental resolve, they cut off their tongues to prevent them from speaking defiance or reciting Sanskrit verses. Yet when the torturers demanded written surrenders, Sambhaji used his own blood to trace the sacred symbol of Swarajya on the stone floor. Skin was peeled from their limbs. Fingers were severed one by one. Yet throughout 27 continuous days of relentless agony, not a single word of surrender, not a single plea for mercy, not a single complaint escaped the lips of Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj. The imperial officers and executioners who carried out the daily orders were utterly shaken by what they witnessed. They had seen hundreds of men broken by the fear of pain. But in Sambhaji, they encountered a spiritual force that seemed entirely detached from physical suffering. A king whose devotion to his country and his principles elevated him far beyond the reach of human cruelty. Finally, on March 11th, 1689, on the sacred day of Mahashivratri, realizing that no amount of torture would ever break the spirit of the Maratha king, Aurangzeb ordered the final execution on the riverbanks at Tulapi, where the Bhima and Indriani rivers meet. Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj and Kavi Kailash were executed. Their bodies were dismembered and thrown into the river waters, while their heads were stuffed with straw and mounted on tall iron spears to be displayed across the major cities of the Deccan as a warning to the Maratha nation. Aurangzeb sat in his grand tent at Badaghat, convinced that the war was finally over. He believed that with the king dead, his body mutilated, and his head displayed on a spear, the Marathas would scatter in terror, surrender their fortresses, and bow before the Mughal throne. It was the single greatest strategic miscalculation in the history of Asia. Instead of crushing the Maratha spirit, the news of Sambhaji's heroic, unflinching martyrdom acted like a blinding spark thrown into a powder keg. A roar of grief, outrage, and explosive fury swept across every town, village, and fort in Maharashtra. The people saw that their young king, who had been accused by political enemies of being reckless, had chosen to endure 27 days of unimaginable agony rather than surrender a single acre of their homeland or compromise his integrity. In his supreme sacrifice, Sambhaji was transformed from a mortal monarch into an immortal god of war. Dharmavir, the champion of righteousness. Every Maratha house became a fortress. Every peasant became a soldier. Every mother sent her sons to the battlefield with a blessing to avenge the martyrdom of their Chhatrapati. The war, which had previously been fought by regular armies commanded by the state, transformed into a total, decentralized people's war. A war of national survival that no empire on earth could ever hope to defeat. At Raigad Fort, Queen Yesubai and the Royal Council organized a grand national strategy that would define the next 2 decades of Indian history. Realizing that Raigad itself would soon face an imperial siege, Yesubai made a selfless, heroic decision. She urged Prince Rajaram, now 18 years old, to slip out of the capital with a small, elite guard and travel hundreds of miles south to the formidable fortress of Janjira in Tamil Nadu. Queen Yesubai stayed behind at Raigad Fort, taking full command of its defense, holding the capital for months against a massive Mughal siege army, buying precious time for Rajaram to establish a second front in the south. When Raigad eventually fell late in 1689 due to treachery, Queen Yesubai and her young son, Shahu, Sambhaji, were taken as honorable political captives into Aurangzeb's camp. Even in imperial captivity, Queen Yesubai maintained her regal dignity, protecting her son and secretly guiding Maratha state affairs through trusted messengers for over 18 years. For the next 18 long, grueling years, from 1689 to 1707, the Deccan became the graveyard of the Mughal Empire. Brilliant, young Maratha generals who had been trained under Sambhaji. Men like Santaji Gopade and Danaji Jodhav unleashed a relentless, terrifying campaign of mobile guerrilla warfare that paralyzed the massive Mughal war machine, moving with unimaginable speed across hundreds of miles. Santaji and Danaji appeared like ghosts, cutting off supply lines, ambushing imperial armies, destroying grand convoys, and even raiding Emperor Aurangzeb's personal royal camp at midnight, slicing down the golden spires of the royal tent itself. Aurangzeb found himself hopelessly trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He captured hill fort after hill fort at immense cost in gold and lives, only to find that as soon as his army moved on, the Marathas retook the fortresses behind him. The imperial treasury, accumulated over 2 centuries by Akbar, Jahangir, and Shah Jahan, was completely emptied. Millions of soldiers perished in the endless, swampy campaigns. The economy of northern India collapsed under crushing taxation, and the central authority of Delhi dissolved into anarchy. The 89-year-old emperor, who had left Delhi in 1681 expecting a 6-month victory, spent his final, bitter years wandering through the mud and dust of Maharashtra, a prisoner of the very war he had started. On March 3, 1707, at the age of 88, Emperor Aurangzeb died in his military camp at Ahmednagar. He died surrounded by the ruins of his grand ambition, having failed to conquer the Maratha nation, having spent 26 unbroken years in the wilderness, never able to return to his beloved capital of Delhi. His death shattered the Mughal Empire into permanent decay. Within decades, the Maratha Empire, reborn from the sacrificial ashes of Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj, swept north across the subcontinent. Maratha cavalry under the Peshwas raised a saffron flag over the red stone ramparts of Delhi and across the breadth of India, establishing a vast, sovereign realm that fulfilled the grand dream of Hindavi Swarajya. If you return today to the high, windswept battlements of Purandar Fort, where our journey began 32 years earlier, and look out over the endless, rolling ridges of the Western Ghats, you can appreciate the true, immortal meaning of Sambhaji's life. He was born into fog and tragedy, raised as a scholar and a prince, tested in the golden halls of Agra, tempered by court intrigues, and crowned in the clouds of Raigad. For 8 glorious years, he stood as an unbroken shield between the largest empire on earth and the freedom of his people. He fought over 200 battles and never lost a single major campaign. He built navies, authored Sanskrit treatises, reformed agriculture, and defended his homeland against impossible odds. And when the ultimate choice was placed before him in the shadow of death, he chose to give his life so that his nation might live forever free. As the evening sun dips below the western horizon, painting the dark basalt cliffs of the Sahyadris in shades of deep crimson, gold, and royal purple, the wind rustling through the mountain passes seems to whisper his name, the Lion of Purandar, the Scholar King of Raigad, the Immortal Dharmave, Chhatrapati Sambhaji Maharaj.